crazy American conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. A couple weeks ago, I made a video about the craziest conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And in that video, it was kind of concerning how many of these crazy conspiracies were either involving or done by the United States government. And in that video, I said if there was interest, I would make a video specifically focusing on conspiracy theories that involved the US government. And overwhelmingly, you guys demanded that video. And against my better judgment, I made it. So in this video, we're discussing crazy conspiracies that involve the US government. Let's begin. The Tuskegee study. There's a saying that goes, if something is free, then you're probably the product. And that is something that holds very true when it comes to the Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee study was a very disturbing and deceptive study that took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. The study specifically targeted black males and how having an untreated disease would affect them. If you're curious about what that disease may be, then perhaps the other name for this study may lend a hint. The Tuskegee study is also known as the Tuskegee Syphilis study. Yeah. This study initially took place from 1929 to 1931 and had relatively innocent intentions. During this time, the Rosen World Fund, a fund that essentially promoted healthcare and education to poor African American farmers, specifically about sexually transmitted diseases. The goal of this initial study was to identify the southern counties in Alabama with the highest rates of syphilis among African American males. At this time, the goal was to simply find this location and find the people within this location that had syphilis and then treat them. Still seeming relatively innocent. This pursuit was successful, and they found that Macon County in Alabama had the highest rate of male syphilis, with over 35% of men being infected with syphilis. Although near the end of 1931 is where this all takes a very dark turn, as during this time the Great Depression was in full swing, and the Rosenwald Fund, which was looking to help the poor African American community, was running out of funding. It was at this point when the Public Health Service, a part of the United States government, approached the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama to see if they would be willing to continue the study, specifically researching the effects of untreated syphilis in African American males. But they only proposed that they monitor these untreated people for 6 to 9 months to gather data and then at that point treat them fully. Remember this timeline because we'll be referencing this later. The Tuskegee Institute agreed to do this research as they thought it was beneficial, not only for their local population but for all Americans. And it was shortly after, in 1932, when the study began. The study began with 600 men being enrolled into the study. 399 of these men had syphilis, 201 of these men did not. Things already take a dark turn here as all 600 of these men were more or less kept in the dark about what this study exactly was about, and they were really only being told that they were getting free healthcare, something that was hard to come by and an appetizing offer for anybody suffering from any sort of disease. Right? Not only did the government say that they were going to give them free healthcare, they also said that they were going to treat these men of their bad blood, which isn't really a medical condition. It was more or less of a local blanket term that just described general illness. Most of them weren't even necessarily diseases themselves, but symptoms, such as fatigue, body pains, anemia, and even undiagnosed syphilis symptoms as well. These 600 men were specifically promised free medical exams, meals covered by the government, and even burial insurance in case they died during the study. That alone should have seemed like a red flag, but at this time it seemed like a deal that was too good to be true, which is potentially another red flag. So consider that 2 red flags. But back to the point. For the men in this study who were confirmed to have syphilis, the government didn't tell them about their diagnosis, and they didn't even give them any treatment either. Now, at this point, you might be asking, why didn't the government simply find people that they knew had syphilis and then simply request that they have the ability to monitor them? These people already had syphilis, and the US government was willing to incentivize them, so why not inform them about the data that you're collecting? The government claimed they took a deceptive path because it was the only way that these men would have stayed in the study, and for the study to work, they needed to be closely monitored consistently over time. But it's heavily suspected that this deception was based on a lack of respect, both because of racial and economic prejudice. Specifically because the study only involved black men, all of which who were poor farmers, which meant they had limited resources and almost no education as well too. And by limited education, I mean very limited, like fully illiterate. So if you're an educated and prejudiced doctor during this time, why would you give these people any real information? Just keep them in the dark. They don't know any better, right? That doesn't sound ethical to me, but I suppose that was their mindset. So at this point, you may be thinking, sure, okay, the US government wasn't fully upfront and maybe wasn't even respectful to these people that they were studying, but so what? It's not like they gave these people syphilis. These people had syphilis. All they were doing was collecting data. And while I personally would say that there is a ton of ethical issues within that already, that is not the worst part about this study. That is only the beginning of this study. After the initial 9 months that this study was supposed to go on, they decided to extend the study and extend it again and in 1934, the first major paper about the study of untreated syphilis was made public. And if you're thinking that now that there's a paper and they can end the study and finally treat these men, you're unfortunately mistaken. And it was at this point when the study was extended once again. And there was even a push from the medical community not to treat these men, but to actually prevent these men from getting treatment so they could see the prolonged effects of syphilis. And this is where we get to the darkest part of this study. The study actually went on for 40 years. And for a majority of that 40-year period, there was actually an extremely effective and safe treatment available. That being penicillin, which was first used to treat infections in 1930, and by 1945, it was accepted as a proper treatment for syphilis. But of course, these men were kept in the dark about that, and were never offered it or even informed about it. And the government simply just decided to watch these men wither away, to see how this infection affected daily life over an extremely long period of time. By the end of the study, it was estimated that 128 of the men in the study died directly from the syphilis that they had. 40 of the men in this study also infected their wives, and 19 of these men had children that were born with syphilis. Those numbers especially are extremely disheartening because those people didn't even sign up for this deceptive study. They were simply the unintentional victim of the unintentional victim. And a lot of these deaths and infections could have easily been prevented by treating these people like they planned on doing. But instead, they decided to simply withhold treatment and monitor them for 40 years. Something that I think any reasonable person would agree is unethical and honestly horrible. Medical studies require consent, and the patients in the study need to be fully informed of the risks and also treatments available, and they need to be treated with respect. And with the Tuskegee study, none of those measures were taken, and it's truly a dark and shameful part of American medical history. But there is a silver lining to this story, as on July 25th, 1972, a journalist named Jean Heller broke the story about the horrific study that had been going on for the last 40 years. And with this news breaking, the government then decided that this study was ethically unjustified, and that also meant that it was immediately canceled. And the following year, there was actually a class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of these men who were unknowingly a part of the study, and they did end up winning $9.5 million in 1973 money. So keep in mind, it's adjusted for inflation, it's around $50 million today. I'm sure for some, this money was extremely helpful and went a long way, but many of the participants never even knew that they were part of a study, never saw this money, and simply died because they didn't know what they signed up for. And even if you did live to get part of this settlement, not only is your body worse for wear for never getting treatment for a disease that they knew you had, but you also likely have no trust in the government, as they just spent the last 40 years treating you like a lab rat, and the few dollars that they were forced to throw at you only feels like too little too late. So yeah, the Tuskegee study started by simply trying to identify counties with the highest syphilis population to begin treatment, and ended with a 40-year study that completely violated not only the human rights of the participants, or should I say victims, but also the medical system as a whole. And as upsetting and disturbing as the story is, at least there was some sort of closure associated with it. This is only the first entry on this list, and we have lots more to cover. The Watergate Scandal. When I first heard the name of this conspiracy theory or situation, I was convinced that it had something to do with the US government putting something in the water. But as you may know, that's not the case at all. And interestingly, this scandal is also the reason why a lot of other scandals have gate in their name, such as Deflategate, Elsagate, and a lot of other scandals that range from morbid to disturbing. So let's give a bit of context before we get into the details of this Watergate. Richard Nixon was the 37th president of the United States. He was an author, a lawyer, and a career politician. But in 1974, his presidency was cut short as he resigned for reasons that involve the Watergate scandal. This entire scandal is interesting and kind of two-sided because there is the initial acts that took place, and then there is the reaction to the exposure of the initial actions. And if you're already confused, don't worry, because I'm going to lay it out simply as possible. This entire situation begins with Richard Nixon being paranoid that he was not going to win a re-election, something that he feared deeply and was willing to do anything to avoid. This included harassing opposing journalists, politicians, and even celebrities who could potentially influence his re-election in a negative way. And he and his administration would harass them by abusing government power in ways such as auditing them and even getting them involved in strange legal disputes and more. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the situation. Prior to the 1972 election, the election that Nixon was so fearful of losing, a group of Nixon's associated formed the Creeps. Creeps meaning the Committee to Re-elect the President. An odd and kind of fitting name. This rather elusive group went to some extreme and even illegal measures to ensure that their goal was met. One of their biggest efforts was collecting information on the opposing party, the Democratic Party. And this is where we get to Watergate. This group of creeps were approved to break into and plant listening devices into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which just so happened to be based in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. The group figured that if they could break into their offices and collect data secretly, they could find some dirt and use it against them to make sure that they win the 1972 election. The first time these creeps broke into the office, the mission was successful. However, on their second attempt, all 5 of these men were caught. And this is where the plot thickens. Because nobody knew who these men were, what their motivation was, and what their goal was. All they knew is that there was 5 spies breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters. Although it's not hard to think of who may have potentially ordered this attack. The FBI began to look deeply into this case to find who exactly was involved and what their motivation and goal was. It was at this point, coincidentally, when Richard Nixon would instruct the CIA to tell the FBI to halt all further investigation on this entire scandal, or at least the finances involved behind the scandal. They were still going to investigate these men, but the funding investigation was blocked. Obviously, this entire situation sparked public outrage, and there was a lot of finger pointing at the Republican Party, specifically at the president himself. And although he and his party strictly denied any involvement or awareness of this essentially spy operation, information was flowing in and the house of cards was crumbling. One of the early pieces of evidence that pointed towards Nixon was the fact that one of these men who conducted this robbery was actually a Republican aide. And on top of that, they had an informant who was feeding them information directly connecting these burglars to Richard Nixon himself. And I swear I'm not even making it up, this informant or whistleblower went by the alias of Deep Throat. Shout out Deep Throat for the information. I feel like if you called the government right now and told them you had information, but you wanted to go by the name Deep Throat, you'd probably get hung up on, but that's just me. Now, despite all of this media attention and this obviously odd situation going on, Nixon did obviously win the election in 1972. However, that was short-lived. The following year in 1973, 4 of Nixon's top aides lost their job because they were involved directly in the cover-up. Through months and months of consistent investigations, there was only more and more dots being connected and lines being drawn directly back to Richard Nixon from these burglars and from this entire scandal. And while everything was still relatively unconfirmed, it became more and more plausible that Richard Nixon not only knew about this situation, but was also directly involved. And it was at this point as well when Richard Nixon's own assistant broke the news that Richard Nixon had installed spy devices all around the White House. And while his intentions aren't fully known, I would assume he did this to benefit himself. And unfortunately for him, these recording devices actually became his downfall, as they were able to prove his involvement. When Nixon's assistant broke the news in court that these devices were installed, the government instantly subpoenaed these devices to hear the recordings that he had captured. And of course, Nixon honored the subpoena and handed over these recording devices, right? No, obviously not. He not only denied to hand them over, but he also exercised an executive privilege, stating that the president should have some right to privacy, which obviously isn't what this was about at all. Eventually, these tapes were handed over, and after thoroughly being reviewed, it was confirmed that Richard Nixon knew exactly what was going on and was even providing hush money to these creeps. The president had 2 options: resign or be impeached. And as we know, on August 8th, 1974, he resigned as the United States president. This entire situation put people in jail, changed laws, and also changed US politics forever, as it was the first ever resignation of a president in the history of the United States. This conspiracy or scandal may not seem extremely shocking at this point, because I feel like nowadays trust in the government is at an all-time low, but that wasn't always the case. And there was a point in time when people had trust and respect for the powers that be and believed that they had integrity. This situation is undeniably bad, as it's a blatant abuse of power and is a demonstration of a president fighting dirty for his own gain. And while justice was served and there was a happy ending to this story, the situation really only exposed likely something that was already going on. So yeah, the president wanted to maintain his power, did some shady things to collect some information to win the presidency, but what's considered worst of all is the fact that he not only denied and lied about the situation, but also used executive orders to prevent the truth from being revealed. Regardless, people in these high positions of power should be held to a high standard, and integrity and honesty should come first. And I hope someday we can return to that. But yeah, let's keep going. Project MKUltra. MKUltra is one of the most notorious and disturbing covert operations in all of US history. And it's for that reason that I'm going to keep this section pretty brief and try my best to make sure that I really only focus on information that you may not have heard yet if you're already familiar. This entire conspiracy theory had one single goal: to explore the methods of mind control and behavioral manipulation in humans. The reason this operation even started was because after the Korean War, American prisoners of war who were being returned home seemed to have been brainwashed, as they were consistently repeating what they believed to be communist propaganda. To the American government, this was very concerning because they assumed this had to be the result of brainwashing from their communist opposition, which meant that if these communists had mind control techniques that the Americans didn't, then they had an advantage over America. And obviously this meant that they needed to develop their own mind control techniques, or at least explore how they would go about it. Already, we're on a pretty disturbing note, but this really does only get worse from here. It was after this discovery when the CIA, which was relatively new at the time, was given $25 million to perform psychiatric experiments on humans. At the time, this was the most hidden and secretive project that the CIA and the US government as a whole was performing. And it'll become pretty obvious why when we get into the details. The government was finding patients at psychiatric hospitals, prisoners from federal prisons, and even random members of the public. And what they would do is dose them with drugs without their awareness and then do experiments on them to see how the drugs affected them. One of the most interesting and notable operations in MKUltra was an operation known as Operation Midnight Climax, which has an oddly fitting name, and essentially consisted of the US government building safe houses. And what these safe houses were essentially fake plant houses where US government funded prostitutes would lure men into these houses and then dose them with LSD where they were being observed, typically behind a two-way mirror in that very safe house. In the last section, we talked about creeps in the government, but this brings it to a whole nother level. Not only were they paying prostitutes to lure men to essentially trapped houses, they would also dose them with drugs without their consent and experiment on them. But that's still only the tip of the iceberg. Another interesting thing that they did was hosting LSD parties, which was essentially a party where music was played and LSD was unknowingly given to the participants of this party. And these scientists would simply observe these people on LSD to see how they would react. And it's believed that these ongoing tests were actually a precursor to the hippie movement, or at least part of it, which is interesting. But MKUltra wasn't just prostitutes and partying. There was a lot of medical mismanagement, most famously at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, where patients with relatively minor ailments would be taken advantage of and experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails. The main doctor at this institute, known as Dr. Cameron, pursued a concept that he called depatterning, and this concept and practice was truly evil. The goal of this practice was to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state, essentially giving an adult the mind of a child. And the point of bringing people to the state was so that the government could take advantage of this extremely vulnerable position and from that point rebuild their mind, giving them an entirely new psyche, thought process, mindset, and belief system to essentially control this person fully. Besides dosing these people with drugs, they would also put these people into comas and play messages over and over again until they sunk deep into the person's subconscious. And they even performed electroshock therapy and other forms of extreme therapy on these people as well. Disturbingly, this entire project went on for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973. And while it's not known the true number of people that were unknowingly experimented on by the US government in this 20-year period, it's likely safe to assume that there was hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of this disturbing study, many of which who were simply never the same, for reasons that they would never understand why. If you're experienced with drugs, then you likely understand how bad it is to have a bad trip, and you likely understand how detrimental it could be for someone who's never had a psychedelic experience to have an unknowing dose put upon them. That experience, for many, is likely completely mind-altering and also extremely terrifying, and it's quite disturbing how many people this had happened to. Although, once again, there is some sort of happy ending, I suppose, as in 1973, the operation was closed, once again by a whistleblower, although this time the whistleblower's name wasn't Deep Throat. His name was actually 69 Lord, I'm just joking. His name was John Marks, and he wrote a book named The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, where he exposed most of the operation. And at that point, after this information had been exposed, congressional hearings began to investigate what was really going on. And it was through those hearings where the CIA not only admitted that the operation existed, but they also were forced to admit what they were doing. To this day, there has been no class action lawsuit, no apology, nothing. And the children of some of these victims are still pursuing legal action against the institutes that they deem responsible. And personally, I hope justice is truly served, as awareness and exposure is one thing, but justice goes beyond just that. It's so ironic that after the Korean War, the US government publicly exposed and shamed these communist countries for their mind control techniques and how they could possibly brainwash prisoners of war and torture them. But almost immediately after giving a speech about how horrible these things are, they then begin not only researching their own methods of doing the exact same thing, but they go about it in likely the worst way possible. And Project MKUltra is a massive example of the US government breaking moral, ethical, and legal laws in their own self-interest, and it's one that people have not forgotten, nor should they ever. What do you guys think? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video was made because of your overwhelming interest and support in the comments of the last video. So I just quickly wanted to make the same offer again. If you guys liked this video and would like me to make a part 2 about crazy conspiracies that the US government has been involved in, then please leave a comment telling me that you want part 2. I try to read as many comments as possible, and I take your guys' suggestions seriously. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention that quickly. But without further ado, let's get to the last entry of this list: the Iran-Contra Affair. The US is still very much in a Cold War against Russia, and is still very much so anti-communist. And it was at this time when the president, Ronald Reagan, promised to support anti-communist insurgencies around the world. Meaning that if you were a country that was currently dealing with a potential rise in communism or the threat of communism, the US had your back to make sure that that wasn't a problem. Typically by providing arms, or at the very least, training. Reagan was particularly interested in a group known as the Contras, and this group was at war with another group within Nicaragua, known as the Sandinistas. The biggest difference between these two groups was the fact that the Sandinistas was a communist group, and they were backed by Cuba. The president, Ronald Reagan, saw the Contras as a noble force, and even equated them to being similar to the founding fathers as they were fighting for freedom. Now this is where things begin to get sticky. The Contras were funding their war primarily through the drug trade, and because of this, the American government actually passed an amendment known as the Boland Amendment, preventing the US government from providing the Contras with any support due to their involvement in the drug trade. So far, this is pretty straightforward and seems reasonable enough. However, it was at this point when Ronald Reagan decided that he didn't want to follow this amendment and continued to support the Contras regardless of the amendment. And how they did this is a bit confusing, as where they went next was Iran. At the time, in 1985, Iran had 7 American hostages that they were keeping in Lebanon, and Reagan wanted to do everything he could to make sure that these hostages came home alive. It was at this point when the government made a deal. The US government, with Reagan's approval, agreed to give Iran weapons in exchange for the release of the hostages. It's important to note that this was all happening behind closed doors, because publicly, Reagan was saying that he would not negotiate with terrorists, and there was even a trade embargo currently going on with Iran at the time. But that's still only where things begin, as the US government technically budgeted $30 million to go to Iran for this terrorist negotiation, although it was shortly after exposed that only $12 million of this $30 million actually went to Iran, and the remaining $18 million actually went to support the Contras, a group that the US government was not allowed to support. This is a bit of a double whammy, because not only was the government negotiating with terrorists, something that they said they would not be doing, but they were also supporting a group that they were not allowed to support. And this was all exposed by a Lebanese journalist in 1986, and the fallout of this is where we truly see the impact of the entire situation. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was in charge of most of these operations, came clean about his involvement and said that he knew it happened, he was part of it, and he also admitted that Reagan knew about all of it. This testimony from the colonel and pressure from journalists caused investigations to be launched against Reagan, not just at the time, but for the entirety of his presidency from that point on. And after these investigations, it was ruled that Reagan's involvement was more or less benign and was simply due to a lack of oversight, and because of this, he was not implicated directly, meaning he wasn't in trouble. At least until 1987, when Reagan finally testified on this entire matter. And while these hearings went on for 41 days and were publicly televised, Reagan would still not face any consequences. However, that wasn't the case for everybody. 12 people involved in this conspiracy were charged and found guilty. Those people being Robert McFarlane, Colonel Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's National Security Advisor, John Poindexter. Undoubtedly, this entire situation stained Reagan's image as a president and as an honest man. However, surprisingly, he was never impeached, never resigned, and actually left office with one of the highest approval ratings in US history, which to me either seems that people were uninformed about the situation or simply agreed with what happened, although it wasn't legal. Not only did it expose a level of distrust for the government, like in Watergate, but it also resulted in the US government literally giving an opposing terrorist organization $12 million out of a hypothetical $30 million that was supposed to be given to them, which I think a lot of people would consider to be a conflict of interest. And while obviously getting hostages home is important, giving them a proposed $30 million of weaponry seems a bit counterintuitive. Combine that to secretly funneling money to an organization that is currently trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that is funded by the drug trade, that's an entirely different can of worms as well too. And whether or not you think these actions were justified or moral, that's a decision that you have to make for yourself. But the point is the fact that the government was lying directly to the face of the people and doing things that they likely would have not voted towards or supported, which some would consider to be unlawful, unmoral, and unethical. And if the person you're supposed to trust is saying one thing to your face and then behind closed doors doing essentially the exact opposite, it's not a good look for the trust and faith in the institution that you're running. And I suppose with that, I do want to make a quick point that although this video is focusing on negative things that the US government has done and been involved with, I don't want you leaving this video with a huge doom and gloom mentality. And I think it's important to note that the government is simply a group of people, and people are dumb for the most part and self-interested. And for that reason, the government is going to reflect the people that it's made up of. That doesn't excuse them of any of its responsibility, although it's important to note that the government isn't this otherworldly thing that is perfect. It's really not. It's literally just people. And ideally, we'd have great people in there looking out for other people, but obviously that's not always the case. But with that being said, I think the point of this video and the mindset I'd like you to leave this video with is not to say that the US government or any particular government is evil and horrible and out to get you. I think it's important to note and be aware of times where the government or any institution has done horrible things, be aware of them, hold them accountable, and also do everything in our power to learn from them and prevent them from ever happening again. And the more things that we're able to expose and have out in the open, the more we're going to be able to see the signs in the future and prevent further negative things from happening. But maybe I'm just too optimistic. Let me know what you guys think. I want to say thank you guys so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video about true American conspiracy theories and scandals, then I think you'd probably like this video on screen right now. It's a video I posted last week about the most wanted drug lords in America right now, where I detail every entry currently on the DEA's most wanted list. And I'll just tell you right now, this is a pretty insane group of criminals, and I think you're gonna like that video. And in case you haven't seen it, I also made another video about conspiracy theories, and I'll put that one in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, trust me, bro.